Our blindness to group identity also fatally undermined our military intervention in Afghanistan. After 9/11, we intervened. This time, we didn't have a Cold War lens. Now we had a big anti-Islamist lens. And we saw the Taliban as just a bunch of cave-dwelling fundamentalists harboring Osama bin Laden. And once again, we missed the ethnic and tribal identities that are all important in Afghanistan. Afghanistan's national anthem mentions 14 different ethnic groups. And the largest three are the Pashtuns, the Uzbeks, and the Tajiks. And the crucial point here, which I'll try to condense this, but I explain it in the book, is that the Taliban is not just a religious fundamentalist movement. It is also an ethnic movement. Afghanistan was founded and ruled for basically hundreds of years by this biggest group, the Pashtuns. A lot of people think of the Pashtuns as the same thing as Afghans. They just use these terms interchangeably. But we didn't know anything about this. And when we intervened, the Pashtuns, long so dominant, had started to lose their historical dominance for a variety of reasons in the Cold War, and they were very threatened by the Uzbeks and the Tajiks. Well, we missed this. So when we intervened and we impressively toppled the Taliban, at least temporarily, I mean, they came right back. But when we did so by allying ourselves with something called the Northern Alliance, that unfortunately was really viewed as being mainly populated with the Uzbeks and the Tajiks, the main rivals of the Pashtuns. So we were seen as allying ourselves with these threatening rival groups. And then the government that we set up was again seen as favoring these other groups and marginalizing the Pashtuns. And this turned enormous numbers of ordinary Pashtun Afghanistan citizens against us. As oppressive as the Taliban is, many Pashtuns would prefer to have them in power than having their rival ethnic groups that they view as persecuting them. So 17 years after we intervened, the Taliban is still around, our troops are still mired there, and almost none of our key objectives have been met. In Iraq, very quickly, we obviously missed the depth of the division between the Sunnis and Shia and the Kurds. We missed the central importance of the tribal loyalties in that country. I just did an amazing event with General David Petraeus last night, and he said this was really the biggest lesson. It wasn't about increasing troops, it was realizing how important these tribal networks were. People would do what their tribal leaders said. Most important, we missed something more specific. And coming back to the original term, we missed the fact that Iraq had its own version of a market-dominant minority. On the eve of the US's invention, Iraq's roughly 15% Sunni minority dominated the country economically, politically, and militarily. They had been dominant actually for a long time under the Ottomans and then under the British, who again loved to do the sort of divide and rule, favoring and ruling through a minority. And finally under Saddam Hussein, who was a Sunni and who favored not just the Sunni, but his own tribes people. And the Shia, the 60% Shia majority, represented most of the country's poor, many of them living in slums outside cities like Baghdad. And I actually predicted what would happen in Iraq in the afterword to World on Fire, my book, in 2003. And not just kind of like, oh, I don't think it will go well, but very specifically, what I said is if you look at these demographics, it's a pattern I've seen over and over. When you have this really resented minority who's been in control for a long time, and you suddenly bring in democracy, you know, America tends to romanticize democracy. Democracy is going to melt away these group identities and bring everybody together. I said that in these conditions, when you suddenly empower this resentful majority, it can actually catalyze group conflict. And that's exactly what happened. You saw these rise of demagogues who, on both sides, and the Sunnis realizing, so the Shias voted for the Shias, the Sunnis with the Sunnis, Kurds for the Kurds. And when the Sunnis realized that as only 15%, democracy was not going to be good for them, they just resisted. They started the insurgency. They didn't want democracy. And it's from there that ISIS arose. ISIS is really a Sunni movement directed not just at wiping out the West, but also infidel Shias. Now, So once again, because of our failure to see the central importance of these group and sectarian and tribal identities, we, despite having unrivaled military power and despite spending over $1 trillion, suffering thousands and thousands of casualties, we failed. We did not end up producing a model of free market democracy for the Middle East. Instead, democracy led to civil war and eventually to ISIS.